everyone. Welcome. I'm Ann Rademacher. I teach here in the program in Environmental Studies and also in the Department of Social and Cultural Analysis. Welcome to the fourth, our last in a series of lectures assembled under the title Situating Ecology, Urban Sustainability Across Borders and Contexts. If you're returning, we're glad that you've joined us again to help continue and develop this conversation around the complications that context presents to both the concept and practice of sustainability. And if you're here for the first time, just a little bit of background about the series. Our objective in both inviting speakers, having them visit an undergraduate seminar in the program in Environmental Studies, and then engage in a public talk and also conversation for the NYU community has to do with both opening and forging at the same time a critical space for dialogue about what we mean by sustainability, both in theory, conceptually, but also in practice. We're interested in asking how and why social and disciplinary contexts matter, what the stakes are of different understandings of and practices of sustainability. And we're particularly grateful to the NYU Abu Dhabi program for making it possible for us to conduct these conversations in the way that we are this semester here on campus. Many of you know in different ways and from different angles that NYU Abu Dhabi has made an explicit commitment to developing itself according to its commitment to sustainability. And we are interested in understanding what that means and through our conversations, helping the program think about what that means. NYU Abu Dhabi is developing and will have an interdisciplinary concentration in environmental studies. And as I said, we're grateful to the program for its support of this series. Thus far, the series has investigated sustainability through the lens first of urban ecology with the urban ecologist from UC Davis, Mary Carnasso. We then welcomed a green architect, Roshni Udyavar, who works for Rachna Sansad in Mumbai. And most recently, we hosted Greg Beckett, who is a political anthropologist who spoke to us just a few weeks ago about the complications of thinking about urban sustainability in Port-au-Prince in Haiti. And now, helping us come in some ways full circle and assemble a lot of the conversations we've been having in bits and pieces along the way around the question of eco-cities, we're delighted to welcome Professor Julie Zee. Julie Zee is an associate professor of American Studies at UC Davis, and she's the founding director of the Environmental Justice Project for Davis's John Muir Institute for the Environment. Many of you already know Professor Zee's book, Noxious New York, The Racial Politics of Urban Health and Environmental Justice, which has won numerous prizes, among them the 2008 John Hope Franklin Prize. This book has had tremendous influence on the field of environmental justice and the conversations about it, not only in New York, but theoretical, conceptual, and practical as they apply to many other cities. Dr. Zee's research investigates environmental justice and environmental inequality, environmental culture and politics, race, gender, and power, and community health and activism. She is a great collaborator and one who constantly reaches outside of and across disciplines. She works with collaborators in the humanities, in the social sciences. In the sciences, she works formally in a collaborative with Mary Carnasso, who was a previous guest of this series, and even engineering, to focus on issues of climate change, culture, and politics. And tonight she's here to talk to us about her most recent work in China. The title of her talk tonight is Fantasies and Fears, Reading Eco-City Development in Shanghai. As is our practice here in the series, I'm going to ask that you please sign in, let us know that you're here and who you are. But you'll notice that coming around there will be two different kinds of sign-in sheets. One is clearly marked Anne's class. If you're in my class, I'd like to know that you're here, so please sign in on Anne's class. And those of you who are guests who are not part of the class, please use the sign-in sheet marked non-class guests. All right? Thank you, and welcome, Professor Julie Z.
Thank you, Professor Rademacher, for inviting me to this series. I am so happy and to be part of it and part of the conversation. And thank you to Carrie Barrett for setting up the talk as well. Again, I'm not the director of the entire John Muir Institute. I'm the director of one project of it. It's also a special pleasure to come back to New York, where I did my graduate work in American Studies and where I see former advisors and colleagues. And my sister is actually a graduate student here, but apparently she's at 19 University Place, even though so hopefully she's a tall lady who looks a little bit like me when I'm late, that's my sister. So it's a interesting audience for me to come do this talk about this new project of mine. And again, I am very pleased also to be talking about this work in the context of NYU Abu Dhabi. And also Professor Rademacher put me in touch with NYU Shanghai. So I've been following a little bit some of the NYU Global University conversations and context. And so I think it's very important to have critical conversation about what the globiversity, I don't know if that's a word that you guys use, the global university looks like. So NYU is also, an important actor in that story as well. And again, Abu Dhabi's multidisciplinary concentration on the environment and the commitment to sustainability and green technologies is a goal that I share. But I also hope that some of you take some of the comments I have to heart in thinking about how we can reach that goal of sustainability with an equal focus on local place and social justice, which are areas of particular interest to me. As you may know from the talk description, and I'm not sure how much of it was posted or not, I'm going to talk today about attitudes and ideas about the environment in China and the US through a focus on eco-city development and suburbanization near Shanghai, which is host of next year's World Exposition. My particular focus will be on a failed eco-city development named Dontg near Shanghai on Chongming Island. And I think even though the project won't happen, and I'll talk a little bit about what are some of the factors that led to its failures, failures are also important to understand as well. And especially because eco-city development is not an isolated occurrence. Dontg is not alone at all. And in fact, for those of you who are in Anne's class, part of the readings you had was to watch the YouTube video about Masdar, which is the eco-city that's being planned in Abu Dhabi. And if you, the promotional materials on Masdar are actually very structurally similar to Dontg as well. The failure in part, I think, is because of this lack or this problem of situating urban sustainability at the local context and scale. I'll tell you a little bit more about why I got into this topic. As you know, my past work has mostly been on New York. I do a lot of work on the Central Valley, a lot of work on environmental justice and community health activism. So on the face of it, this might seem very different. So I want to start with talking a little bit about my methodology and the main questions that structure my interest in this topic. Before I get into the details of Dontg, I want to talk about those methods and questions so you have, again, a better sense of why and how I'm interested in this topic and again, how I hope to get into to research it. I come at this topic from the perspective of American studies, specifically a transnational American studies, as opposed to, say, Chinese environmentalism. That is, my main interest is not as an expert on Chinese sustainability or Chinese urbanism, but as someone who has worked in the past on urban environmentalism in a global city context. Again, much of my work recent work has been focused on collaborations with disciplinary collaborators in the sciences on climate change and the cultural representations of how climate change policy is developed and also climate justice movements. So again, my focus is very cultural as opposed to sort of a scientific approach to environmentalism, and urban environmentalism in particular. Dontg was supposed to exemplify a green approach to urban design, architecture, and infrastructure, including sustainable energy and waste management, and also economic and business planning. According to materials from the project proponents, Dontg, quote, represented the quest to create a new world, end quote. Dontg was supposed to represent a fundamentally different model for Chinese sustainable urbanism, one that explicitly rejected the idea that there would be economic development first and then environmental protection to follow. The city, which again I said failed, and it's not going to be built in the form that it was proposed, but the city was slated for a population of 500,000 people by 2050 on wetlands, some of the richest wetlands on the, in China. It's a big bird migration route. It was supposed to be completely carbon neutral and completely zero waste, where all inputs for energy came from collected waste through renewable sources and methods. And it was supposed to be basically a residential development of 50,000 people on wetlands areas. I study the stories that people tell about urban environments and the meanings that they are assigned. So I'm not so much interested in, and my expertise is not is focused on the facts of Chinese pollution, but of the how and why eco-islands and eco-cities and eco-developments, particularly in national political contexts that are politically authoritarian, such as China and Abu Dhabi, have been given almost magical solution to the problems of global environmentalism, especially the problems associated with global climate change. So my talk today is drawn from a larger book project that I'm at the beginning stages of, and that book is aimed to non-specialists primarily. And my initial interest in this topic is that it's the island that my father is from. So I read about this island and I said, wow, Chongming, that's interesting and weird. And the more I started sort of going into it and trying to understand what this all meant, the more I sort of got pulled in. And so the key topics today, or the ideas that I'm going to introduce, are eco-authoritarianism, the obsession with the techno-fix, and the tension between the global and the local. Dontg, I argue, represents this tension and this ambivalence between technology and nature, and the politics of local and regional place in a global context of anxiety about Chinese urbanization and development. To give you some context of this, of what I'm talking about, I love pointers. I have a 3-year-old son, so I'm not allowed to have one of these, otherwise he's pointing it all the time in our face. So this is China right here, and this is Shanghai. I mean, that's Shanghai, that's China. That's Shanghai, this is Chongming Island, and that's Dontg. Chongming Island is either the second or the third largest island in China, depending on if you count Taiwan. And again, incredibly politically contested. But in the writings about Chongming, the government says it's the third largest island because they count Taiwan. So this, again, I'll talk a little bit about Shanghai, but I just wanted to give you some spatial context. I'm interested in the language that frames contemporary environmental politics of globalization and the concern with China's pollution, and also how these concerns dovetail with American anxieties at the beginning of the 21st century. Chinese pollution, in other words, has a global character and a complicated context, one that gets subsumed under the burdens of representation. Take, for example, the media concern over the impacts of Chinese pollution, of Beijing's pollution on the global environment, which reached a high-pitched fervor in 2008 in the coverage over the Olympics in Beijing. The coverage, I think, was a good example of this repurposing of environmental discourse for geopolitical use. NBC's early coverage of the Olympics focused on the extreme air pollution produced by Beijing's factories, construction sites, and motor vehicles. Ostensibly a story about public health and the health of high-performance athletes, the unmistakable effect of the drumbeat of Chinese smog reports was to correlate Chinese geopolitical with environmental threats. When the world record holder in the marathon declined to compete in the Olympics in order to preserve his health, the international news coverage was intense, as it was when the American cycling team arrived in Beijing airport with the masks to filter out the particulate pollution that they claimed would affect their performance and long-term health. During the games themselves, various US media outlets made coverage of the atmosphere and air pollution a major part of their narrative of the Olympics. So the AP set up an air monitoring station on the Olympic green, and media web pages had air quality widgets alongside the medal count on some of their websites. Hopefully that explains the title a little bit of my talk today, which is focused, again, on fantasies and fears and the reading of eco-city development, because I read architectural plans or actual built sites through this discursive and cultural lens. So just what are the stories that get told about the sources and meanings of global environmental problems, and what kinds of fears are they designed to address? In the US, these fears are about the broader implications of economic shifts in manufacturing, on top of the concern about the actual environmental implications. Recall, of course, that in the last couple of years only, China surpassed the US in total carbon emissions. These fears and anxieties have historical precedents. In writing about the symbolic role of China in the US, prominent Chinese-American playwright David Henry Hwang suggests that, quote, competition between US and China will continue to intensify, end quote, and that ultimately Americans will experience a new round of yellow peril rhetoric, one that recalls, adapts, and updates the host of late 19th century anti-Chinese cultural attitudes and policies that culminated in the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. In part, I'm suggesting that the focus on Chinese pollution can't be separated from this discourse, this racialized discourse. Signs of this resurgence are already visible in the cultural landscape in the search for contaminated toys, milk, pet toys from China, even drywall. And you can see that a lot in media representations of Chinese pollution. So reactions to this pollution, in other words, become one mechanism through which we can analyze how rich global industrialized nations like the US culturally make sense of our changing historical and political power in a moment of global environmental, social, and economic crisis. At the same time, the story I hope to introduce to you today is not just about the US, or is it about Shanghai's representative status for Chinese eco-development? Shanghai does not equal China, and it never has. Shanghai has always had a complex relationship to the outside world because of its unique history, both as an attractive place for internal migrants and also as its, quote, status as an emblem of national humiliation. Of course, British colonialism and the establishment of the French concession. You know, Shanghai is a colonial history, in other words. Shanghai has always been different, and it stands alone, crassly commercial, decadent, haughty, and critical. And Shanghainese people, like Parisians and Londoners, often look with a little disdain to their country migrants, even to their neighbors in Chongming. The historical tension between Shanghai and Beijing as alternate power bases proffering different models of development and with fundamentally different cultures is also at play in the story of Eco-Shanghai and Shanghai's intensive modernization. In part, my interest in Dontg stems from my interest in understanding what it means to be part of the Shanghainese diaspora and to learn more about the city, the language, the politics, and the culture at a crucial time when the forces of Chinese nationalism, global economic development, and Shanghai's aspirations to catapult Shanghai into the ranks of the world's great cities are converging. Some of you might have heard this term, Shanghai, Mumbai, Dubai, as the places where the global finance, people are supposed to go. Of course, Dubai has been in the news a lot recently. And where the forces of transnational finance, the Shanghai, Dubai, and Mumbai, are already radically restructuring the urban landscape. As cultural critic Sheldon Liu suggests, quote, in the hearts and the minds of a local Shanghainese or a diasporic Shanghainese, the city transcends the myopic scope of the nation state and occupies a special place that is like no other in China or in the world, end quote. So I'm interested in this story, but from a fractured and quixotic place of nostalgia, memory, and diaspora. It's from this place of diaspora, and with a focus on the discursive, that I focus on the ecological in the most hyper-urban of cities. Today I want to make an argument. So that's the sort of how I do this and why I'm interested in it. And now I want to sort of slide into the what. So today I want to make the argument that beyond the rhetoric about Shanghai as China's urban prophecy, which is the tagline, if you go to the Skyscraper Museum, they actually have their entire series right now is on Shanghai, where that's their tagline, Shanghai is China's urban prophecy. That another key component of that discourse is about ecology and sustainability as part of that project, that ideological project. In other words, the Shanghai miracle, rather than just a reprise of the modernist discourse that brought Hong Kong, Singapore, and Taipei into the nexus of world city status, is that the ecological is a new critical component of that contemporary discourse of world city development, not just in China, but in places like Abu Dhabi. And again, this came up in the class discussion, and it was a very good point, that it's a particular version of sustainability. It's a globalized discourse that is primarily high-tech, and also corporate. The Shanghai Ecological, which is, I'm kind of borrowing from Leo Lee's famous term, the Shanghai Modern. The Shanghai Ecological, in other words, is an important part of Shanghai urban development discourse, and Dontg is an example of that, with all of its contradictions, complexities, and paradoxes. So I think in addition to understanding the global sustainability discourse and its function in world city development, you of course have to understand the local, but also the complex politics of the region and the nation as well. To give you some context for the national environmental policy, in 2007, China exceeded the US in total carbon emissions, although the per capita rate is still much lower. This fact is an important backdrop to the question of why the ecological becomes a key term in Chinese national environmental policy, and in Shanghai when it did. So that's the temporal question. But the form, so that's the why, but the how and the what, I think, is also as interesting as the when. The convergence with ecology and green building is also a response to recent priorities in China's national environmental policy. At the 17th National Congress of the Communist Party in Beijing in 2007, President Hu Jintao coined the term Shanghai Wenming, which essentially means ecological harmonious socialist society. Jintao argued that China, quote, must pursue comprehensive, balanced, and sustainable development and build resource-conserving and environment-friendly society so that our people will live and work under sound ecological and environmental conditions, and our economy and society will develop in a sustainable way, end quote. This is the first time that the Communist Party highlighted the concept of ecology and put it on the party's agenda. He continued that the emergence of Shanghai Wenming is a global revolution which is related to, quote, the mode of production, lifestyles, and the concept of value. It is an inevitable global trend. It is a new choice for human society after agricultural civilization and industrial civilization, end quote. And he called for awareness of Shanghai Wenming to be firmly established in society. So I think for trying to understand what this all means, it has a practical effect. I talked a little bit about how much money and the investment in Chinese environmental industries has been growing at about 18% a year. But I think for Western environmentalists, this can sound, on the one hand, incredibly captivating, and on the other hand, you can be incredibly cynical about it. But I think what I want to suggest is that there's this idea or this psychological investment as China, so China on the one hand is kind of like the global polluter. On the other hand, it becomes this place where it's like the green go-to place, tied to this Western fascination with the kind of what I call the good side of the political authoritarianism. In other words, there's a strong strand of ecological discourse captured by eco-authoritarianism. One good example of this is Thomas Friedman, the New York Times columnist, in his book Hot, Flat, and Crowded, in talking about the ability of the Communist Party to ban plastic bags in 2008. This is a quote from Friedman, quote, if only America could be China for one day, just one day, italics, exclamation point. As far as I'm concerned, China's system of government is inferior to ours in every respect except one. That is the ability of China's current generation of leaders, if they want, to cut through all their legacy industries, all their pleadings, special interests, all the bureaucracy, all the worries of voter backlash, and simply order top-down sweeping changes in prices, regulations, standards, education, and infrastructure that reflect China's long-term strategic national interests, changes that would take Western democracies years of decades to debate and implement. What would be so bad? China, just for one short day, end quote. He admires this increasing attention that the Communist Party has paid to environmental industries, which he calls green GDPism, and calling it potentially, quote, the greatest show on earth, end quote. So that's a little bit of a backdrop of the national context of the Shanghai of Dontg. Let me get to Shanghai now. Many of you, if you think about Shanghai at all, which I'm not sure, if you do or not, you think of it in the same terms as New York. And a lot of people have made this New York-Shanghai connection. And this might be the image that you see. This is a view from the Bund, which is, of course, a historical place where the banks were, the English banks, where HSBC's founding, the edifice. And that's Pudong, which in the 80s was just rice fields. And that's where, all the Pudong miracle, happens there. Pudong is also where the new Chinese Disneyland is going to be. The Skyscraper Museum current series on Shanghai lays the stakes out very high for the importance of Shanghai to the world's urban future. Shanghai now has 3 of the world's 10 highest skyscrapers. One of them is these tall buildings here. Since I have the pointer, I can use it. The one that looks like a bottle cap. As the exhibit proclaims, Shanghai is surely China's prophecy of the urban future. It asks, if New York was the 20th century city of the future, is Shanghai the New York of the 21st century? Whether Shanghai is the prophecy of the future, it currently claims the world's fastest train, the longest underwater pedestrian tunnel, the world's tallest hotel with the world's highest swimming pool, and I love this, the world's longest laundry chute. Part of this feeling that Shanghai represents both the China and the world's urban future is about scale and population. Shanghai has an official population of around 19 million, 5 million of whom are floating population from other parts. They're not registered. Shanghai's population puts it among the top 10 ranking of world cities based on population, whereas some would argue that if you accurately count the migrant population, it would probably be one of the top 5 largest cities. Let me see. And all this construction right now, the photos today are either taken from my photos from Shanghai or from this book on Dontg, and I think it'll be clear which ones, but if you don't know, please ask. So this is all the construction that's going on right now for the World Expo. They're kind of sprucing it up. This is the World Oriental Pearl Tower, which is a TV tower in Shanghai. Shanghai History Museum is in the basement, which I think is kind of interesting, symbolic. So again, much of the Shanghai, if you go right now, feels like a big construction zone. They're getting ready to clean house, in other words, for this. So this is, I think, a lot of what Shanghai looks like now. And one of the people I was in Shanghai with is here. I love this photo because I think there's all this construction. This is on the main road, commercial road. And I love this be the icon right in front of this sign, which is the thing telling you to go to the founding of the Communist Party, which is just down the street, with this top brand's luxury life. So a lot of what Shanghai looks like, I think, and this is, not as an expert, is sort of remaking it in the vision of Hong Kong or Tokyo. A key feature in contemporary Shanghai, again, I would argue, is the role of ecology in this utopian branding of the future. For example, there's a new development that's being built right now, set to open in 2014, called the Shanghai Tower. And it's aimed to be the second tallest building in the world. And its green features are a key part of its innovative design, including 9 indoor gardens and design for increased energy efficiency. Again, a cynic can view the prominence of ecology in Shanghai as greenwashing. An optimist, the only answer to future shock. I think it's also very clear in the planning to the World Expo. And this is a model of the main pavilion, and it's actually really interesting. Shanghai has an urban planning museum that's like 5 stories tall, but the World Expo has its own temporary exhibition site, and where literally there are throngs of people waiting to get in to sort of look at what it's going to look like next year. It's a huge excitement and energy. And my colleague who was there with me said, God, it feels like, now I think I know what being in Chicago in 1891 felt like, or, Paris before, that exposition, or San Francisco. Just 2 years after the global spectacle of the Beijing Olympics, China is about to take the world stage in the Shanghai World Exposition. And this time, instead of the fuwa animals and the flame mascots, the bright blue haibo is the ubiquitous symbol made and sold in every possible form. Stuffed animals, keychains, blow-up dolls. My son wouldn't let me take the blow-up doll that I was going to bring as a prop, but I'll show you the symbol. So this is also one of the signs for the World Expo, one of the exhibits. And I think this is from the Shanghai Urban Planning Museum, which has the largest model of a city. It's of Shanghai, but this is a separate temporary thing that's been put up. So this Shanghai 2010, this is the subway station that's sort of right in front of it. And Shanghai 2010 is going to be the first World Exposition held in China and only the 4th in Asia of the almost 50 held since the mid-19th century. So it's a mighty big deal to the Chinese nation. Although locals often grumble about the noise and construction, are seriously divided in their enthusiasm. In their run-up to the Shanghai World Expo, and these are translations from Will Thompson, who's in the audience. He's a grad student at NYU who works on China. Thank you, people, for their understanding and support for relocation, end quote. often in the sites where large-scale demolition of housing just took place. Other signs say things like, hand in hand, eradicate messiness and untidiness. The main theme and symbol of the World Expo is Better City, Better Life, which I think immediately begs the question of what is better and for whom. The sub-themes of the World Expo, and again, this is from like the World Expo promotional sites, are that the main theme is, quote, about interactions between urban and rural areas and of Chinese wisdom in urban development. And it shows just how important the idea and the symbol of the ecological is to the World Expo and to Shanghai. In the publicity materials, the idea of better city and better life aims to be, quote, a powerful and lasting pilot example of sustainable and harmonious urban living, end quote. In a political context where calls to harmony often equal suppression of the unharmonious. And Haibo itself is tied to these ecological sub-themes, not just as a creator of a better life, but through its experience of a better life, the blue representing the sea, future, and technology that embodies the essential characteristics of Shanghai. And so this is the Haibo thing that's supposed to look like the character for people. And you will see it everywhere in Shanghai right now. So this is these are the shiny images of the Expo. We took a visit down to the Expo site, and this is what it looks like, not surprisingly. So there's always, I think, a dark side to the shininess of that kind of language. And the Shanghai Expo is an important context to understanding Dontg because the first phase of Dontg was supposed to open for the World Expo, explicitly. And it is also connected because there is a new bridge that has just opened that is connecting Shanghai to Zhongming. And when my dad was growing up, Zhongming was 8 hours away by boat, and now it is accessible by car 20 minutes from Pudong. And I think there are lots of interesting restructuring questions that immediately raises. So I wanted to spend some time talking about the World Expo because that's the sort of political context in which Dongten's development was pegged. So this bridge also just opened like October 31st. And again, it's actually, the main engineer is the same global engineering firm that was supposed to build Dontg. So, I mean, I'm not trying to say this as like as like some sort of conspiracy theorist, but if you actually look at the companies that are behind the projects, there are actually a very few number of companies that are behind sort of major urban development context, urban planning. Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill being one of them. Arup is the one I'm going to focus on today, and so on. So there are very few number of multinational global engineering architecture firms that are sort of behind. They're actually the people who implement the fantasy. So the next few pictures are from the promotional book that Arup put out. Oh, and this is basically, I think, a really good symbol of the ecological for the Expo. Dontg was proposed by, the client for Dontg was the Shanghai Industrial Investment Corporation, and the builders were supposed to be Arup, a global planning, engineering, design firm. And so you may not know Arup's name, but you certainly know their work. They were the ones who built the bird's nest in the Olympics. They built the water cube, they built the CCTV tower in Beijing, and they built Terminal 3 at Beijing International Capital Airport. So that's just their recent China projects. They also built the Pompidou Center, the Cal Academy of Sciences. They're sort of very well known in the field of engineering and architecture. Before the project Dontg failed, it was a very, very big deal. In 2005, UK Prime Minister Tony Blair and President Hu Jintao attended a ceremony in London where Arup and the client, Shanghai Industrial Investment Corporation, signed this agreement to expand and develop Dontg. Further, in January 2008, Blair's successor, Gordon Brown, and the Shanghai mayor watched the signing of another landmark MOU on Dontg. Dontg, again, I said won't be built, but it is by no means unique. So diagnosing the failure of Dontg is, I think, still interesting, given the broader cultural context of this kind of the popularity of the eco-city concept. Let me talk more about this quest to create a new world. And again, that's the language from the press release on Dontg, which I think evokes all kinds of utopian and spectacular fantasies and creation myths. And I think there's a special role for imagination, words and images, in urban planning and architecture, which I think also always have a strong, I think, utopian and also a dystopian edge. Oh, these are pictures of the bridge that just opened as well. So again, this is the bridge. It's a tunnel to this island, then a bridge to this island. And then ultimately, the point, there will be another bridge that connects this part to Jiangsu. So essentially, there's going to be a corridor between here on an island that's always been an island, which I think that's really, interesting. This is the opening events. This is what the bridge looks like. So this is the outside of Dontg. Right now, there's a big, right before you enter it, because it's wetlands. So even though Dontg is, the eco-city's not there, there's still Dontg wetlands. Protect birds, or bidvers, love Dontg and develop eco-Shanghai, which I think sort of, capture a lot of what I'm trying to say here. And these are my pictures of Dontg. So now I'm moving to Arup's promotional book. And the top, the looking for, that's from the book again. Looking for Dontg. It started as a sandbank, then it grew into an island. Soon it will hold the world in awe. What is it? It is Dontg. It opens with this, kind of language. And if you look at the book as a, literary person, you try to figure out the narrative structure of it. So it opens with this call, but it has to create also this, what is the project? And then again, to explain the project, it has to explain what the problem is. And so, again, these are the images from the book about the problem of intensive alienation and Chinese urbanization. And, of course, masses, of people. And this problem, and again, this is their language, looking for Shanghai, incredibly fractured image, the cutting, and so on, the focus on cars, the apartment buildings. And so if this is the problem, why do it? Why build it? And when I did an interview with the project manager, and he was very insistent that it's all about the birds. It's about protecting the birds. So they have looking for the spoonbill. More pictures of birds, and then more pictures of all the various crops, because Chongming's a big agricultural economy. And I think it's also really interesting, to put them in the way that they're putting in. I think, I don't do a lot of work, but I think there's an interesting history of engineering, engineering culture and engineering ideas. And I think a lot of it can be represented, I think, by the grid pattern. In the US, of course, the cultural representation of the environment is as a place of nature, a place without people, and where people do harm to the environment. Arup, even though they're a British firm, reenacts this representational problem of humans and the environment, even when it depicts the image of the island's past. So this is the one picture in the book that kind of talks about the past. And of course, the past is what's interesting to me, given my own family history into the island. This is the port of Chongming, which I don't know how they found one picture that doesn't have any people in it, but they did. And I think that there's an ambivalence that Arup has and the project has about the question of people. And there's a basic question of what happens, I think, when you propose a city of 500,000 people on wetlands and promise not to harm the birds. And the only way you can do this is to discursively construct or focus on the supposed benefits to the imaginary residents. These, again, are photos from Dontg. And here's the text that goes with it. Have you tasted homemade cheese? Smelled the fragrance of the hay in the barn? If not, take a walk to the Energy Center, to the International Eco Farm. The Eco Farm is located to the north and to the modern agricultural district, which consists of a Sino-Italian eco farm, a Sino-German eco farm, a Sino-Japanese eco farm, and a Dontg Taiwan folk village. People will be able to visit different places: the Florentine village of the Italian eco farm, the picturesque architecture of the Sino-German eco farm, and the Hokkaido buildings of the Sino-Japanese eco farm. And you will also get to experience the Aboriginal appeal of the Taiwan folk village. And I think there's nationalist politics in there. While appreciating this beautiful vista as relishing the local fruit, vegetables, locally produced sausages, cheese, and beer, and hearing oral music, visitors will find themselves back in the good old days of the past, as well as in the 21st century. I don't know, maybe there are other Chinese people in the room who can tell me that you have a beer and cheese eating culture, but I don't come from one. So my family is not a beer. We also don't use butter. But anyway, again, an imaginary journey to the year 2020. It's an imaginary journey through space and time. We felt a little tired. Again, these are quotes. We felt a little tired, but we were able to travel on foot, by boat, on horseback, by solar-powered vessel, and of course by hydrogen-powered trolley cars and buses and motorbikes. The convenient transport system with its leisure transport network consists of bridle paths, cycle paths, and footpaths, in which we chose boating to see the lakes and canals, which constitute the unique charm of the city and demonstrate the island's individual water space, integrated with the river and the infra-city canal network, the Central Lake area, and the port. I don't know who talks like this. And I also don't know who these people are because they look mostly white to me. You know? I mean, you know, to be fair, there's some Chinese youth right there. So back to this question of why Dontg failed. There is no simple or single answer to that question. There were conflicts between different parties, between Arup and the client, the Shanghai Industrial Investment Corp. There was a conflict between the Shanghai Industrial Investment Corp and the Chongming County. There was changing national policy over farmland taking. There were internal differences and political transitions. The old board, who was a big proponent of Dontg, retired in 2008. There were values differences, whether or not Dontg should be car-free or not. And then there were most obviously a political obstacle with the former Shanghai Party secretary and Dongten's main supporter accused of corruption and sentenced to 18 years. So those are some of the why reasons. But to me, the question of why Dontg failed are rooted in a different set of factors, which wouldn't sort of go on that list. The inherent contradictions of eco-city development and its utopian roots, especially in the context of eco-authoritarianism. A reliance on building solutions, the obsession, in other words, with the hope that we can engineer an eco-future, the idea that we can have a techno-fix for environmental problems, and of course the lack of a focus of the local scale and cultural context, and the erasure of history and geography. Let me talk a little bit about the ideological context. There are eco-city developments going on all over the world, and many in China, and other places like Korea, India, South Africa. They're all very different from one another, but I think the Chinese eco-cities are most similar to Masdar in Abu Dhabi. If you watch the YouTube video, it's rhetorically the same as Dontg. Masdar is a planned city in Abu Dhabi, being built by the Abu Dhabi Future Energy Company, a subsidiary of the Mubadala Development Company, with the seed capital from the government of Abu Dhabi. Designed by British architectural firm Foster and Partners, this city will rely on solar energy and other renewable energy sources, with, again, zero carbon, zero waste ecology. The city is being constructed 17 kilometers southeast of the city of Abu Dhabi, next to the international airport. I think China becomes the blank slate for ambitious architecture and engineering firms seeking to build high-tech eco-developments because political authoritarianism can create a context for bold action, nearly impossible in Western political democracies. The prospect that China can leapfrog over industrial pollution into new sustainable urbanism and development, and, most importantly, make money in the process, captivates Western urban planners, architects, and environmental professionals. So another sub-theme in the project is I'm really interested, again, in the role of these transnational architects and engineering firms like Arup and Skidmore, Owings, Merrill. Dongten's complications are not unique. Some of you may have heard about Huang Baiyu debacle. That was the reading that was assigned for the class. But for those of you who don't know about it, this was a project that was widely touted and then kind of fell apart, closely associated with William McDonough, who was the former dean of architecture, former dean of the architecture school at University of Virginia, and is widely recognized as the father of green architecture. And his most famous book is called Cradle to Cradle. In his writings and speeches, he advocates a vision of balancing economy, equity, and ecology through design. Yet one of his projects, the highly anticipated Eco-Village project of Huang Baiyu in northern China, is also a controversial site where local farmers refused to move into this prototype of eco-housing. Huang Baiyu had very glowing and then damning publicity, in many ways like Dontg. And the project failed, according to its former resident anthropologist, Shannon May, in part due to the lack of understanding of the local rural Chinese context in which the imaginings of global sustainability were projected. Over 40 houses were built, but they remain empty and doomed as a Potemkin village. The costs of constructing this eco-village were far beyond the local economic capacity, and the local reality was utterly ignored in the design of the buildings themselves. For example, garages for private cars were built for many of the houses, though not one single local family owned a car. Many peasants refused to move into the new houses because the yards were too small for their domestic animals that would reduce the family income, and it would also cut them off from the fields in which they worked. So Huangbayu went from being a highly anticipated eco-future to being completely banned off the company website. Again, this idea of this desire, this hope to believe that we can engineer the future is very obvious, I think, symbolically, again, in the Arab material on Dontg. So again, these are images of the National Wetlands Park, and very sort of high-tech, sci-fi quality to them, pods, that kind of thing. Local farmers don't know, like the local farmers in Chongming, like the local farmers in Huangbayu, don't know much about the details of what an eco-city means. The former peasant, Tai An Ding, talking about Dontg, he was moved into an apartment in Chengzhou town after his land was confiscated. And in one interview, he was confused by the concept eco-city, though his new apartment is under the name of an eco-building. And this is a quote from him: "For us, ecology means living in a green area where some places have trees," end quote. Roger Wood, again, the Arab project designer, was very insistent that no one was displaced. But I think, there were people who actually were displaced, so that's not true. But I think the larger issue of displacement is more about the transformation of the island itself. As the island becomes connected to Shanghai by car. So let me show you, this is a picture I took when I was there in August. The bridge is open, and the last 3 weekends, there have been over 100,000 people go in every weekend from Shanghai to go check out this thing. So the questions about accessibility, the very nice modernist building of highways, I think, the bridge structurally changes the conditions of everyday life on the island. And there's a lot of heated debate on some of the Chongming local, websites. There are blogs where they talk about this, and here are some of the quotes about whether someone asked, "Do we really like this bridge? Are we happy?" And I think, like any group of people, there's a range of responses. One person said, "It's not convenient. I thought I could take the bus from central Shanghai, but I had to go all the way to Chengzhou, so it's not convenient for me being from the West." Another person says, "It's only for tourism." The other person says, "I'm sick of taking a boat." The boat company that monopolized the transportation system always, had us by our balls, and now we're not powerless to them anymore. We're not subordinated by that company. Another one said, "A construction of road leads to wealth. We have waited a long time for this. Our Chongming economy, especially the economy of Chengzhou town, will have huge potential for development." Another person says, "A real estate market will be developed when the bridge is open. Who will dare develop Chongming's real estate? Who will dare destroy Chongming's ecological environment? Shanghai has only this clean place left." And this last quote, "Why do they charge a bridge fee? We've been subordinated for a long time from Shanghai. We were charged long distance service fees to call central Shanghai, and many schools refused Chongming students." So there's been a historical divide between the urban and the rural, which, my dad's from Chongming, my mother's from Shanghai, and so, I saw that played out in a very, micro scale. We occupy 1/5 of Shanghai's land. Give us Chongming people's rights, which should be the same as Shanghai people. So again, I don't want to say that there's a simple or easy answer about whether this is good or bad. That's not really the point. But I wanted to raise up this question of the bridge because I think the larger questions of displacement is not about individuals' houses, though those individuals are important, but it's about the transformation of the island in relative to this intensively urbanizing place.
Julie, how long is the bridge?
Oh, long. It's so long that it's a bridge and a tunnel. So a tunnel for the first part to that middle, there's a middle island, and then there's, and the middle island people feel even more put upon than the Chongming people, the people from that island. So, yeah, it's one of the world's longest bridges. I mean, it's technological marvel, again. So, let me go back. In conclusion, deepening our understanding of the cultural stakes of eco-city development and ecological discourse in Shanghai depends upon unpacking the symbolism behind a very different set of images. From the top down, fantasies of Dongten's development without costs and a technologically utopian eco-city. For me, these questions pivot on the efficacy of techno-utopianism and the problems of erasing relocation, questions, of course, of migrant labor, which is Will's area, and regional identity. So this is the migrant housing that's been constructed just for the workers who are going to build the Expo, and that will all be taken down. And this, so the eco-city, I mean, the Expo site would be like right here, and this is where it is. And their English slogan, which Will also pointed out, was said the English slogan and Chinese translation are also really different. So the English version of this is touch the future, experience Shanghai. And then the Chinese word says like, you don't need to leave the country to experience the world or something. So I think, there's a lot of interesting simultaneous messages that are being performed in here. Not all of which, I'm fully, aware of. And I think this question is also important when you think, I was reading this article that was saying Wenming, in the Shanghai Wenming, also is tied to a history of talking about civilization in terms of civilizing behavior. And there's a history of that in sort of 20th century discourse, Chinese political discourse. And you can see that in this, properly use the elevator, even though it's an escalator. The World Expo concerns everyone. So a lot of it has to do about, we're civilized, this is our entry into like the global city. We have to sort of look good for everybody who's coming to visit. I think, to me, this is what Chongming, this is the thing that greets you about it as a vacation. And also, I think it's kind of interesting, but this was the sign if you go to the ferry terminal, which I guess nobody's really going to go there anymore, but it has this sign about please speak Mandarin, because the local dialect is Shanghainese. And so again, there's lots of politics about the region and the nation that are at play as well. So what I want to end up is, why I end the talk today is with some hopefully provocative questions and that can generate some good discussion, because I really would appreciate your feedback on this. Can projects like Dontg and Huangbayu balance local impacts with the supposed global discourse of environmental benefits? What is the meaning of the Shanghai Ecological for China, for Shanghai, for the US? What are the limits and the fantasies of containment that the eco-city inherently embodies? What are the internal contradictions of high-tech ecological development? And I want to end, I hope that this talk invites a healthy skepticism about eco-solutions that depend on authoritarian structures of governance and which can create their own sets of regional and social injustices. Basically, I wanted to sort of spend some time thinking about, the impulse of, wow, that's cool, to, what is that all really about? So again, and close with this picture of the before and after of what the bridge has brought to the island. Okay, thanks.
Could you compare this vision with Disney's vision for Epcot and Centennial, and also how Disney developed Disney World from swamplands essentially?
Can you repeat the last part of the question? I didn't hear the last part.
Well, essentially, Walt Disney to develop Orlando from
Yes.
swampland to Disney World. So can you compare the Disney vision with the vision that's out there in the world, with Epcot bringing the world to you,
Right.
and also Centennial, planned development where basically no one is free to take for themselves.
That's a really good question. And for a while, the Chinese Disney was supposed to be on Chongming. And I was so excited. I mean, I wasn't excited for the island. I was excited for my project, which is a selfish reason to want, because in many ways it's the perfect analogy. And I think the fact China Beat, which is a blog by Jeff Wasserstrom, who's a Chinese historian at UC Irvine, he just posted this talking about the Shanghai Expo and its connections to Disney, which I didn't really even know, but Walt Disney's dad apparently worked at the Chicago World Expo in 1892. And he borrowed a lot of this language, and this kind of, the idea of Main Street USA, from the World Expos, in the US, basically from his father's experiences. And then he talks a lot about the Epcot. So definitely, I think, the idea, I presented this and somebody said, this seems like Disneyland. And I think, that's another part for me of the fantasy, that there is a way in which it can seem sort of very fantastic in the way that, John Finley's a urban historian of the West. He has this concept he calls magic lands, where he talks about these kinds of spaces where you have the kind of cultural construction of an investment in modernity, through the Seattle World's Fair, through the high-tech center near Stanford, and different other cases. So I think that's a really good point. And I think as the Shanghai Disney is going to be developed, I think and the Shanghai. So now Shanghai Disney is going to be in Pudong, where that landscape is. So supposedly that's where NYU Shanghai is going to be. And so I think, again, this idea of, this kind of global city and what are the markers of that global city, are very complicated, and complex. And I think that, we will continue to see more of this with the Disney development. So.
This is just sort of a clarifying question.
Yeah.
The eco-cities you've worked or you've studied, who is actually expected to live in eco-city? I mean, you mentioned that villagers didn't want to move into the city because it wasn't really built for them. Is this something that's marketed to people from Shanghai to move here and live, or is it something that's supposed to be integrated with the people that are already living there? I just am a little unclear about that.
That's a very good question. I think it depends on the context. The Huang Baiyu case, the local villagers were supposed to live there, even though the cost of the housing ended up being twice of what people could afford. I think in this case, I think that, a lot of the details are always left very unclear. I think that we talked a little bit about this in class, about the kind of structure of real estate speculation right now, in Shanghai in particular, but, in a lot of Chinese cities. I think the idea is that I don't think it's for foreigners to live there. I think the idea of the white rowers, is to sort of entice people into this idea of modernity through, consumption, and how you live. And so I think it is for the Chinese middle class, the Shanghainese middle class. And, I think a lot of people, I was talking about this other development, this Thames town, which is, there's a few years ago, Shanghai also developed this 9-city strategy to kind of release pressure on the central city. And, all the cities were supposed to have a national theme and national development. So there's a British city called Thames Town. There is a German town called Anting, which is where the workers for the Shanghai Volkswagen company live. There's an Italian town, and each place is supposed to look like those countries, And there, the theme park feel is very strong because, I was telling the class today, Thames Town, I went with a colleague of mine who's an architectural historian who's English, and he said, it's a very good approximation of, but it's an assemblage. It's Victorian architecture, it's, all the New Canary Wharf, it's all this, stuff put together. And that it's basically empty. Nobody lives there because it's too far. And I went with a family friend's daughter who's 18, and she was very excited to go because on the website it looked really cool. And then she went there, she's like, oh, I would never live here. I would never live here. And I said, well, what if it was free? She's like, I would never live here. It's like if you send people, if you're from New York and you send them it's literally, they're really far away, and the only people, but is it a success or a failure? And it sort of depends on what you mean by success and failure. For the developer, it was a success because they sold every single house that they had, but nobody lives there. So it feels like a dead place, and the only people who are there are couples that are getting married because they have a wonderful looking church that's completely hollow. There's nothing in it, but it's a facade for you to take your wedding photos in front of, So, I think, the criteria of success or failure kind of depends on who you're talking to and talking about, I definitely don't think it's marketed towards, the international elite, to the finance, people who are going to spend time in Shanghai. It's to the middle class, But what I think is interesting is how the symbols of consumption and ecology are parts of that way in which, your belonging in the cutting edge of modernity and global citizenship are constructed.
No, can you explain how they sold all these apartments and nobody lives there? To whom did they sell them?
People who...
Did they sell them?
Well, I think that people who think that it will someday be a viable place to live, So I think, a lot of it is investors. I mean, I think, I think a really good example is that there was a building that fell down, like a year ago, and it got a lot of press. Somebody was telling me about it, and it's kind of like a high-end, development. It just fell down, but it was completely, fully bought, before it fell down, and I think that, is this kind of metaphor for what urban speculation and real estate in Shanghai kind of looks like now, So, I mean, who bought it? I think it was, Shanghainese investors.
And from whom? I mean, was
The
this,
developers.
is this private, completely private, or is there a government component in this ownership?
I don't remember on that case. I haven't fully finished my research on it. But I would guess probably it was a quasi-government, structure. We were talking a little bit about this earlier today, about how, understanding the Chinese context, there's a lot of sort of quasi-public, investment, arms. So the line between private and public and government and, corporate are much different in China. And these are things that, I'm still kind of learning through. But that's a good question.
And can you buy land completely free and clear in China, or is the land perpetually owned by the state, but you have a long lease? I mean, that's an arrangement in Europe, for example, a 99-year leasehold and things like that. What goes on in China?
Yeah. Leasehold and freehold. I cannot give you a really good answer to that, but that is a really good question. So, yeah, because I don't think that you can own the land in the same way because, it's still officially, so, yeah, it's an important question. Yes.
So the issue about China is global polluter and, for example, carbon dioxide. So just a few years ago, China became the #1 emitter. But as you pointed out, that the per capita is 1/4 the emissions in the United States. So I get really interested when I look at this rhetoric that happens in the news. And any reporter that talks about this knows that the per capita is really low. And yet, there's just this almost cognitive tendency to want to make these countries be entities. Because there could be this, there could be a sense here, we're supposed to do something, and yet China emits more than we do, and they don't have to do anything. That's unfair. As if it were individuals, of people, being human equals. There's something happening cognitively with that.
Right.
And I wonder if you maybe want to talk about how you see that issue, because it really can guide the Americans to displace or delay any sense of responsibility with regard to CO2 emissions, for example.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I think, there's a lot of ways in which this idea of fairness are used in different contexts. So China would say, well, it's not fair that you're asking us to restrict. We've always, you've already developed and you're asking us to slow down, and that's not fair. And China and India, basically if you look at the planning of the World Expo, they use this language of developing country, like they're a developing country, they're a developing country. They're a developing country, yes, absolutely. And if you go to the outskirts of Shanghai, it feels like a developing country, or what one would imagine a developing country to be. But if you also go to the center of Shanghai, it also, China also owns a huge amount of American, national debt. And so how do you sort of make sense of these things? And I think, the question precisely is that these are very conflicted discourses, and that it's important to sort of be able to disentangle them. I talked today in the class about how the problem of talking about emissions in a national context, because again, this question of responsibility gets complicated. I was telling somebody, I was mentioning this study that there's this British group that said, well, okay, British national emissions are 5% or something, but if you calculate it by British factories working in China, that number goes up to 15%. So what is the best way to capture emissions? Do you use a national scale, or do you think about, okay, well, China is the world's factory, they're producing lots of stuff for Western consumers, how can you complicate that discourse a little bit? And I think that's precisely, the thing that I'm interested in, is how this language gets talked about, when and by who, and also in a cultural sense. I was struck by these photos here because I don't know if any of you know the work of Ed Burtynsky, the photographer. And he's most well known for a series called Manufactured Landscapes, but he has a series called China. And these look exactly like the China photos, like in form, like the large scale, and it's an amazing series, and you should take a look at it. But I think he also does some of the same symbolic problems, you know, which is he's talking about in the China series, he looks at 3 gorges, he looks at Shanghai's urbanization, he looks at recycling facilities in southern China. And they're all, you know, amazingly detailed, rendered, and they also are, I think, pretty strong clarion calls for action in some ways. On the other hand, discursively, I think they recreate this problem of responsibility too. So if you look at the cover of Manufactured Landscapes, there's a documentary film and there's also the actual book. It's a picture of a yellow horde of Chinese workers in a factory. And you look at it and you go, wow, yellow. They're actually a yellow horde. This is actually, did he really not think about, this is kind of interesting? And I think that the Bertinsky photos does the same symbolic act, which is it focuses on, again, that massive scale that the Dontg book is of Chinese urbanization. It's anonymous, it's overwhelming, it's frightening, it's Paul Ehrlich doing the population bomb all over again, you know? But then there's no attention, even though he actually in his post, he writes in the China book about, you know, well, we as Western consumers have a responsibility, you know, but none of the representational apparatus that he's doing actually does anything with that. There's no pictures of Walmart. There's no pictures of, you know, all the stuff, you know, that Western consumers buy, you know. And I think that, so that's why, you know, as a cultural question, I'm particularly interested in how this is kind of reenacted, but also sometimes contested as well. So, but I think that's a really great question. Troy.
In your account of the failure of this project, you said there was no single determinant there, some multifaceted, multi-tiered, and so on. On the other hand, you must have a sense of what particular things were more important than others as a way of learning about what happened. So could you say a little bit about what you think are some of the key aspects of the failure?
Yeah, well, I think, you know, again, I'm not saying this as from a definitive standpoint. I think most of the attention, you know, when it gets talked about, has to do with the corruption charge against the Shanghai party secretary who was most closely associated with this project. And I think that is also, so I think that probably is the most important factor, but that also raises all these questions about, I think that was also part of a power move, you know, between Beijing and Shanghai. And there's another eco-city being planned near Beijing that has much more full support by the central government, you know. And I think, you know, there are interesting questions of, you know, who gets arrested for corruption and why. You know, I mean, there are lots of corrupt politicians in China, you know, and nothing happens to many of them, you know. So I think you know, the best way to probably answer that question is to compare the failure of Dontg with the propulsion of this other project called Tianjin, which is a much more of a central party Beijing power base eco-city development with the Singaporean government, you know. But I think that, you know, I'm not really sure that I know which one is the most important. I mean, it's kind of funny. It's Arab, when you talk to Arab, they say, well, you know, we thought that the investor was going to pay for it. And then the Shanghai Industrial Investment Corp said, we thought Arab was going to pay for it. And you go, really? Could you really be that confused about who was going to pay for a project? So, I mean, I think that, you know, a lot of it is about, you know, spinning and, you know, it's not always clear as an outsider, you know. So, I mean, that's my best probably guess right now. Anne?
I want to ask a follow-up question around these issues of the line between public, private, and government. Because at the same time that you're talking about this problem of eco-authoritarianism, you also mentioned that there is a website where there was a debate going on, and you read some quotes from it, right? About jumping. Can you talk about where there is dialogue and who's having it that might in any way interact with the top-down models that, you know, are enacted on the landscape?
That particular website it's called like the Chongming Club, and it's a place for Chongming diaspora people, many of whom are in Shanghai, but not just in Shanghai, to kind of reflect upon Chongming's development and to vent, apparently, and so on. So I think, again, there are lots of questions. This, project is taking me into areas that I've not done a lot of research on, and so a lot of it is sort of, I'm coming new into it. And, the question of, again, about why there is censorship of some sites and not others, is again, not always clear to an outsider. We talked a little bit about this in your class today, about what are the assumptions, about structures of governance and sustainability. And, what I said in the classes and what I'll say now is that I don't think that it's really, there's a simple answer to that question. I think it depends on the political context and it depends on the country, And I don't know. I mean, I think that, on the one hand, it's easy to sort of be really cynical about Dontg. I mean, how can you read that and look at that stuff and not sort of, be incredulous about it? I mean, it is like reading like a bad romance novel or something. On the other hand, I think there is a very real, there's a huge amount of real investment that's going into, sustainable industries in China. And there's also, a big, I think there is a very real desire by the party to kind of figure this stuff out because the stakes are really high. If the rural parts of China, which is the majority, are still poor and not part of the urban prophecy of Shanghai, And so I think, the places where you're not going to see, where I'm not going to see it, is in, local organizing against relocation. Do you know what I mean? I think those kinds of websites would be shut down instantly, but I don't know. I mean, I think that it's this weird it's the weird way in which authoritarianism and censorship are functioning in China, which is yes and no, at the same time. So I don't know. Will, do you have thoughts, questions?
Actually, I was curious about the, where you're talking about the utopian there and how, what you said at the beginning about how this was the reverse of what China was doing in other places. That first it was economic development and that this was going to reverse that. But in your last slide, which was great, I hope you enjoyed your vacation. That it was just vacation. There was really no, from what I understood, no industries, no real work. It was someplace you go when you have money already. And that seems to be something that China's facing, is how to do ecological industry and make money. And this seems like a sort of perfect place where, just like there's not enough space for both the car and your animals, and the car is the user object. I was wondering how the people who were talking about moving there, what they were planning on doing for business or for work.
Oh, I mean, I don't think it got as far as, doing like a market study of who would actually live there. I think it's sort of build first and see what happens and see who buys, And I think, the target market is, again, affluent, urban, middle class. I think the original proposal, before it all fell apart, was that the local farmers, and, Arab was so careful about saying there's no displacement, and in fact this is going to help the rural population. But the ways in which they say it's going to help the rural population have everything to do with the fact that the farmers will farm for the people who live there. That's how they answer that question. The fishermen will fish for the people, so that's the source of income. Do you know what I mean? Which again, raises this question of how do you, what does it mean to incorporate into the market, economy? And the kind of dislocations that it entails in this context. I don't think that, again, there's tons of studies, or if there are, they're certainly not available to me, of who their imagined, purchaser would be, and how they would actually do this question of, equity alongside ecology, to use McDonough's terms, But that was certainly part of the language, of it. And I think, it's hard to believe that language when, you look at the bridge and when you look at the other bridge to Jiangsu, and how is this not going to be just a corridor? for the region. So I don't know.
I think I'm moving up with this question, but Julie, did you see any intersection between human rights, the language of human rights, and the development of sort of ecological, particularly the desire to improve the situation of the world population?
I don't think that a human rights lens was used for it. I think it was a development lens. And we talked a little bit today, someone asked a very good question about why the Huang Baiyu was in a village context, you know. And I think there's a lot of language of lift, uplift, you know, that's part of that, you know, incorporation into the miracle, you know, the economic miracle, but it's not framed through a human rights framework. Yeah. Mm-hmm. No. So.
Great. Any further questions? Well, please join me in thanking you.
Thank you.